So
Okay.
after that first recording project, you then started a sort of performance career. So explain how you moved from just being, a guy who had a record
Right.
to a
Right.
performer.
Yeah, and I gotta say, I mean, I did it all backwards. You're supposed to perform for years, then you get a record, right? Okay, so it was. I really. Oh, so the other thing about the record is that. Do you remember when there was Steve Allen, the TV host, who was
Hmm.
a superb piano player, and at one point, using another name, he did an album that was supposedly sort of the missing link between early New Orleans jazz and modern jazz. And he, assumed this persona, and he did all these compositions, and the critics, and then the liner notes were like, "Oh my God, we just discovered these tapes in a basement," and the critics fell all over themselves. It was all a hoax, right?
Right.
We don't use the word hoax anymore, but you know,
Right.
and so there was at least some suspicion because here's this. It's June Apple 002, June Apple Records. June Apple 001 is the great Nimrod Workman and his daughter Phyllis Boyens passing through the garden. But it came out after my album, New Wood. So here is a brand new album from a record company that nobody's ever heard of, with good reason, from a place, Whitesburg, Kentucky, that nobody's ever heard of, with artists that nobody's ever heard of, right? And it is my favorite part is we were young, man. We were young, and I mean, I was the oldest, and I was like 29, and so we pledged to each other that we would not cooperate with the star system, and we would not sell out to Hollywood and big music. A really serious danger, right? Right. So we refused to put our pictures on the album, and we refused to do any biographical notes. It totally backfired. So people were like, "Oh my God, what is this?" It had an air of mystery, and that got it a lot of play and some very nice notes and stuff. And the album, I mean, it's for its time. It's I looking back, I'm really very. I think it's just really cool. I mean, it's friends, in the gay community tell me that it's the first song on a. I'm going to use the word mainstream. This is the first song about a gay relationship. So about this curtains of old Joe's house, about these two gay guys in a southern town. A friend of mine um, said that he was in the gay men's chorus in San Francisco. Somebody came in holding the record and said, "You're not going to believe this." Obviously there were records within the gay community, but I mean, I hope it wasn't the first, but it may have been. There's some feminist anthems, there's some union songs, and so people are like, "Where is this coming from?" And it was cool, and I loved, the nice things that people said about it. It was like, being a musician was pretty cool. So I decided 5 years later, I thought, I want to do this again. I want to do another album. So I called Jack Wright at Jude Apple, Records, and said, "Hey, Jack, let's make another album." He said, "Well, Si, I'd love to, but our deal at Jude Apple Records is everybody in the mountains gets one album before anybody gets two." I said, "Well, that seems fair. You think maybe like next year?" He says, "No, I think it's more like 10 years from now." So, okay, so that route is out. So I called my friend Tommy Thompson of the Red Clay Ramblers, now sadly deceased, much too early. I said, "Hey, Tommy, what am I going to do?" He said, "Oh," he said, "you should be on Flying Fish," right? That's sort of like saying, "Oh, you should, you know, I don't know what the equivalent is. Oh, you should be touring with Beyonce." You know, I'm like, "Oh my God, Flying Fish." He says, "I'll call the president and tell him that he needs to put out an album by you." I am imagining, you know, a stainless steel tower on Madison Avenue with with a silver-haired executive in a Hermes suit and tie sitting behind him at a mahogany desk saying, "Yes, Tommy, what can I do for you?" Little did I suspect that it was Bruce Kaplan in a decaying house, the Fish House, in the Chicago slum. So I and then the next thing I know, I'm being invited to the University of Chicago Folk Festival. First public appearance, right? I now know, and I confirmed this with Tommy before his death and with Bruce before his death, both big losses. So what happened is Tommy said, "Hey, Bruce, you ought to put out Sycon's second album." And Bruce said, "Hey, I love his first album, and I, theoretically, sure, but there's a big problem." And Tommy said, "Well, what kind of problem?" He says, "Nobody has ever seen him. Nobody's ever heard him." Tommy says, "Well, what do you mean?" He says, "I see him all the time." Bruce said, "Where do you see him?" He says, "Grocery store, occasional concerts." Says, "Was he playing?" He says, No, somebody else was." Bruce says, "Have you ever seen him play?" And Tommy says, "Well, actually, come to think of it, no, but we get together all the time." He says, "What do you do when we get together?" He says, "Oh, we talk philosophy and politics." He says, "Have you ever seen him hold a guitar?" Tommy says, "Not that I could think of." Bruce says, and remember, the background is the Steve Allen hoax, right? and Bruce says, "You expect me to put out an album that even you, who are pitching me, agrees the guy's never been seen playing music. Nobody's ever heard him. Nobody ever." And Tommy says, "Yeah, I guess you got a point." Bruce was the major money behind the Chicago Folk Festival. They were in the same building. So he hung up the phone. And did you ever run into Bruce? He had a violent temper. He was a big guy and could be really intimidating. Walked down the hall to the office of the University of Chicago Folk Festival, pounded and pounded on the desk and said, "I demand to know why you've never brought Sycon to the festival." "It's okay, Bruce. We'll do it. So basically, he wanted to see if I was alive, if I owned a guitar, if I played guitar, right? and when it was over, and he didn't speak to me, and I said, "Well, would you be interested in putting out an album?" He said, "Oh no, didn't I say that?" So so that was, and then he got me an agent, and then Josh Dudson at Real People's Music to represent me, and I started doing concerts. It's all an accident, Steve. Really,
Yeah.
And it was fun. It was fun. I enjoyed it. I got to meet and perform with people whose music I loved. It was just really, really cool. I mean, here I am being teamed up with people like, at one point, it's just that after I played a very modest role in helping break the boycott by the American labor movement of Pete Seeger, who had, they had blacklisted him because of his left-wing activities, which is to say, for being a good American.
Right.
And it was something like 40 years he hadn't played anything related to labor except for some of the outlier, some of the more left-wing unions. But he told me, he said, I can count on one hand the number of AFL-CIO related, concerts I played. So I ended up, he and I, after the boycott was broken, we did a Southern labor tour. We did a dozen concerts, all hosted by mainstream unions and by union presses. And at one point, I remember this really clearly. I think it was in Durham, and we're on stage together. And Pete says, "What do you think we should do next?" And I told him afterwards, I said, when I was like in college, I used to, cough up $1 so I could sit in the new nosebleed seats and listen to you. And here we are on stage, and you're asking me what we should play next, right? I mean, is it not even going to go into the names, but it was just a magical gift to meet people like, Bernice Regan and the Sweet Honey and the Rock and John McCutcheon and Utah Phillips and and to have the Fairfield Four backing me up, on a labor stage. It was just, I mean, what's not to love? But that's which is sort of to say it's all happy accidents. I am nothing but grateful, and it's never. Well, I think, Steve, the other thing that I didn't plan, but I think really worked out, is that I never did more than a dozen concerts and maybe 3 or 4 festivals in a year. It kept it at the hobby level. I mean, I do consider myself a professional musician, but it kept it fresh and alive. It never became, oh my God, not another concert. So yeah, and then over the years, I mean, I got to work with so many extraordinary musicians, and to record with John McCutcheon, with the Looping Brothers in Germany, to play festivals all over Europe, all over Canada. Um, it's just nothing short of wonderful. Nothing short of wonderful.
All right. Well, a couple of times you've mentioned John McCutcheon, who was also part of this series this year, the Homegrown Concert Series, and
because you guys have very good judgment.
Yes, and he's done him before as well. So, talk about. I mean, I know that you're very dear and old friends with John. So, explain your relationship and your musical partnership a little bit.
Sure. Happy to do that. So, John and I met on a picket line in Harlan County, Kentucky. We think it was Thanksgiving, either 72 or 73. I was working for the United Mine Workers of America on a very bitter strike in Harlan County, known as Bloody Harlan.
Yeah,
appropriately so. It's called the Brookside Strike. Was at the Brookside by this. For your listeners and I guess and viewers who are interested in sort of how these things happen, there's a wonderful movie called Harlan County, USA, by the then young filmmaker Barbara Koppel, now quite famous. She did the Dixie Chicks movie Shut Up and Sing. Great filmmaker, and I think it was one of her first films. And to my knowledge, the only documentary about our country's working people to win an Oscar, and appropriately so. So I was, on the picket line every day, not just watching, and with the picket line, you want it to be miners, not outsiders. And John had just moved south. He had convinced St. John's College in Minnesota, Wisconsin, to give him credit for researching the music of Appalachia. And, John tells the story. He says, it was Thanksgiving. I didn't know anybody, and I had no place to go. So I figured, well, go to the picket line, right? And which is, I think it's not computer dating, but it's a good way to meet. And it's just, we have been the best of friends ever since. First and foremost, it is a friendship. It is a friendship, we have gone through all kinds of things together. I remember him coming to my father's Shiva. For some of your listeners who don't know, that's when in the Jewish tradition, after somebody dies, you basically mourn for 7 days, but you also tell jokes, and the neighbors bring food. It's a really healthy goal. But he drove up from Charlottesville to Bethesda, to Chevy Chase for that. I'm a godfather to one of his kids. We've celebrated together, we've mourned together, we've done tours together, we've written probably 300 to 400 songs together, which is kind of stunning, right? Most of which I said, well, do you have that? He said, somewhere, John, everybody knows John is one of our most brilliant musicians. I mean, he can play anything at an extraordinary level. He's a wonderful performer. And what I think people don't know about John is what a humanitarian he is, and how helpful he has been, not just to other musicians, but, he's always socially involved. And I mean, at one point, right after the war, back when the Sandinistas were good and were freeing themselves from the dictator, and after the war, John discovered that the entire country didn't even have an 8-track recorder, and he went down there and he recorded the entire folk music of the country. Got Rounder to put it out. That he helped. The great Woody Guthrie song "Deportees" about the the migrant workers who were killed in a plane crash at Los Gatos. And John discovered that there was no monument to him. And he helped arrange a monument with the names of it. He never takes public credit for this. He might not even be happy with me for telling people, but I think that's one of the things that I love about John. I'm happy to listen to great musicians. I want to spend my life with good people. I want to spend and that's to me what matters most of all. So yeah, um, the way we used to do this, because I live in Charlotte. John lived for a long time in Charlottesville, and then and people always end up at the wrong airport, like
Yeah.
yeah, and not to mention Charlie East and Charlie West, which is Charleston, the two Charlestons,
Right.
um, because our kids were grown and John's were just starting out. That I started early, he started late. So I would fly to Charlottesville. He'd pick me up to the airport. We would go out for sushi at the same restaurant, right? Sushi and sake.
Mhm.
And we would brainstorm the album we were going to write, right? So at one point we were writing John McCutcheon's Four Seasons because the copyright had run out on Vivaldi and we were in no danger of being sued. So, okay, it's spring. Okay, what do we want to write? Well, what happens in spring? So we riff. And we'd come up with maybe 30 possible songs, right? Sushi will do that to you. And then we'd go to the house and we really did assembly line stuff. Our goal was always to write at least 20 songs in 3 days, and it would be assembly line. So, John would say, okay, how do you like this piano lick? I'm like, I like it. He said, what's it remind you of? I said, I don't know. I'll go to the next room. Then I'll come back. What do you think about these lyrics? He said, oh, what do you think about this guitar riff? And then I go to the next room and he come back. He said, oh, I just wrote down a verse and a chorus. You got a tune for us? I said, let me go sing. It was intense. It was crazy. It was wonderful fun. And then I would be, and we were writing songs specifically for John to perform and record, right? So I don't do much co-writing, I except with myself, my split personality. But I don't like writing on a spec. I've done some with some wonderful songwriters, and they're like, well, I'm going to pitch these to these people. What's fun for me is to work with an artist who's going to record the song. So we're writing to their style, and we're writing to their musical range. One of my other favorite people to write with is Tom Chapin, because he's got these amazing family stories. And
Yeah.
the dude was always, I go up to his house on the Hudson, and we don't go out for sushi to start, but I'm like, so what stories you got? And he's like, okay, here's what about my great uncle who was a friend of Thomas Wolfe's at Asheville, and then he moved to Provincetown, Massachusetts, where he became Dorothy Day's lover. I'm like, Dorothy Day, the founder of the progressive Roman Catholic movement. Well, she was a bohemian in her younger days, and they were living on the beach. I'm like, okay, song, right? So yeah, but we're crafting for Tom. So that's what John and I did, and I think I have no idea how many of the songs we wrote together is recorded. We wrote the majority of the Four Seasons together, a couple other family albums, and then the songs are scattered throughout his other work, and this and with both John and Tom, I also enjoy writing for people who are wonderful artists, because then the songs are so much better than they were in my head.
Yeah.
Yeah, and John and I remain close. I'm talking to him tomorrow. He was the second president of Local 1000, the American Federation of Musicians. We're having a whole strategy thing. It was John helped me figure out how to get my pension, and we it's just the closest of friendships, and it's enhanced by admiration for each other's craft.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So that's wonderful to hear, and we're so happy to have had you both in the series this year, which is great. One thing that you've done as a writer that's a little bit different from writing songs for another singer-songwriter or another singer, is writing musical theater projects. And you've done
Absolutely.
a number of these based on people who were also involved in traditional music. So
Yeah.
why don't you tell us a little bit about your musical
Sure.
theater
Well,
pieces?
it turns out I'm a lifetime member of the International Bluegrass Music Association. People think of me as a stone folkie, but I'm as much in bluegrass as I am in folk. And I've done a bunch of bluegrass albums, several with the German bluegrass band, the Looping Brothers. One with Pete Wernick and Laurie Lewis and Tom Rosem and Todd Phillips and Sally Van Meter. So, I really am in both. And so and I lobbied the IBMA, the International Bluegrass Music Association, saying, "Hey, could we do a workshop on musical theater for bluegrass artists?" And they finally said, "Okay, Si, you want to do it." Like 20 people showed up, and half of them had written musicals. Right? What is the show this year? Hadestown.
Yeah.
By a folkie, right? This is Anais Mitchell, who went to Goddard College, one of the alternatives. So yeah, so I think there's a lot of that. Um, so with John, so John says to me one year, he said, I think I'd really like to do a musical theater piece. I said, John, that is a great idea. You would be wonderful. He is John is just an extraordinary storyteller. He's often at the National Storytelling Contest in Jonesboro, Tennessee, and on stage, he moves. I can't move. I can't move. You know, I stand there stiffly behind the microphone. One time I tried to move, and Elizabeth, my beloved, said, "Please don't ever try that again." I'm just nothing but awkward, right? But John's fluid, and I said, yeah, you're a natural actor, although one can only be natural, so up to a point.
Hmm.
So what do you think? He says, I think what I want to do is I want to do a a musical about the Davidson Wilder strike and the murder of Barney Graham, and this is a strike in Tennessee, and sort of legendary. And I said, you know what, that is a great idea. He said, and if I want us to write the music together. I said, perfect, I love it. So when do you want to do it? He said, well, not this year, we'll do it next year. I said, okay. So November, I called him up. I said, okay, I'm making my calendar. Want to block out time for your musical? He said, I got this Australia tour, I got this California tour, I got this record I got to make. Let's do it next year. I swear, this goes on for like 7 or 8 years. And I finally think, it's never going to happen. It is never going to happen, right? So I thought, I'm going to write him a Pete Seeger musical, because, if there's anybody who can play as many instruments as Pete and who has this sort of, John is much more buff. He works out. He's
Yeah.
although he used to be very skinny when I met him, but it's okay. He's tall and lanky, and so I thought he'd be a great Pete Seeger. Then I'm visiting with my friend Danny Goldberg, who manages Steve Earle. And I'm so, hey, what's my buddy Steve up to these days? He says, oh, he's about to write a Pete Seeger musical. And I'm like, oh, no, please, no, And, I'm not going to steal another artist. It doesn't happen. Steve never did it. So I came home this was in New York. I'm really disconsolate. And, Elizabeth says, love, what's the matter? I'm like, oh, Steve Earle stole my idea. He didn't know I had the idea, right? And I said, and there's just nobody else that is, a political songwriter, and I don't know what I'm going to do. And she said, well, what about Joe Hill? I'm like, oh, Joe Hill, right? So I just decided. So every year, Elizabeth and I, for 40 years, we do multiple writing retreats. So we always do a fall retreat at Pawleys Island, South Carolina, our favorite southern beach, partly because the houses were built in the 18th century by free black laborers.
Mhm.
They've mostly burned down or been knocked out of Hurricane Hugo, but it's a wonderful place, not a single commercial establishment. And I thought, okay, I'm going to write a Joe Hill musical for John, right? But I'm not going to ask him anything. I've given up on that. So I order I've got a pretty good collection of this stuff. I go down there, I do a first draft, come home, work on it, work on it, work on it, using only Joe Hill songs. I mean, at first I thought, oh, because most of my musicals I write the songs, but I'm like, I don't think if I'm doing a Joe Hill musical, it should be my songs. It should be Joe Hill's songs. So I finish it up, and all the songs are known. He only wrote about 20 that we know of. Right? There obviously far more, but much is lost. So I printed it out, wrapped it in gift paper, put a bow on it, put it inside an envelope, sent it to John with a card that said "Happy Birthday," even though it wasn't his birthday. So he gets it up. He says, "What is this?" I'm like, "It's your birthday present." He said, "Well, what is it?" I said, "It's the one man." I could be gender specific because it's John, right? I said, "It's the musical that you're going to perform." And he's like, he said, "Well, tell you." He said, "Well, thanks so much. This is great. You're a great friend." He said, "You know, I think I can use this and kind of use some of this language and just kind of ad lib on stage." I said, "If you want to do that, that's fine. That's, but if you actually want to do something that's called a play, you have to memorize it." He said, "I can't memorize that many words." I'm like, "John, how many songs do you know?" It is different, you know.
Yeah,
Yeah, a song is what I call a demonic device. The word that demonic device, But so he said, "Oh man, I just can't do this." And then, like 9 months later, he calls up and says, "I'm memorizing it." So, yeah, I remember we rehearsed at my sister's in New York. He did a reading, with a script in front of him at the historic Judson Memorial Church. Is one of the great civil rights churches. And then I brought in the person who has been my most consistent director, Elizabeth Craven, who was in charge of the theater department of the University of Tennessee for years and had her own theater now out in California. We did it out there, and and then during the 100th anniversary of Joe Hill's execution by firing squad by the state of Utah on John did a national tour, and we ended up when Joe Hill was assassinated by the state of Utah, and I think it's in 1915. I think it was on November 15th. It's probably not quite right. So the night before, John and I flew in separately to Salt Lake City, and Joe Hill was executed at dawn. Right, it tends to be when they execute people. It's also when you rush an airplane that's been taken over by terrorists. Because I thought you'd want to know that just in case you ever have to rush an airplane, right? Yeah. So, and then at dawn, the prison where he was shot to death is gone. It's now kind of a nice open air park. But Utah Phillips got the architectural drawings for the prison, and he put a stake in the ground. He says that's within 5 feet of where the chair was, where Joe Hill sat blindfolded and was shot to death. So we gathered. There were, Utah's Sun was there. There were people had come from England. There's about 20 of us, and when dawn broke, we just stood there in silent vigil, and then we sang his songs. And then John performed it twice that afternoon in front of 5 cameras for the DVD, the brilliant DVD that he made. And then that night he did it in, before an audience of people who knew who Joe Hill was. And then there's a wonderful book about Joe Hill that came out recently. Bill, we worked together, Brown Lug organizing years ago. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name. So we had a reading at the bookstore, just extraordinary. So that's how that came to pass.
What's the title of that musical?
Pardon?
What's the title of that musical?
It's called Joe Hill's Last Will, because when Joe Hill was on death row, he wrote a poem and gave it to the jailer before they let him off to execution, and it's referred to as Joe Hill's Last Will. You can get so John did a couple of things. One is that there's this wonderful DVD. He really he was great. He was just great in it, just fabulous. And he and Tommy Slothmeyer, his road manager, they designed a set that was completely portable. The only thing they had to take with them was a window, and then then the people had to supply, whoever was hosting had to supply an iron bed and a chair. Very, very. I'm very interested in portable theater that can be taken to the people everywhere. A wonderful third generation actor named Vivian Nesbitt
Mhm.
um, is touring nationally. Her husband, um, John Dillon, who's a guitar builder and a music director, they're touring my musical Mother Jones in Heaven, and they bought an RV called the Mothermobile, and they're everywhere. And I love this. I love the idea of bringing art to the people, not expecting people. And they've played union halls and they've played rallies. It's great. One last year when the United Auto Workers were on national strike, and they were performing that evening in Lansing, Michigan, and Vivian and John went to eight separate picket lines in Lansing, with her dressed as Mother Jones,
Hmm.
fully in character. And she would say, "Boys, it's Mother. I heard you were out on a strike, and I knew I had to come help, but we're gonna lick that company. And I just want you to know that I'm standing with you always." All ad lived, right? And it's great. I mean, this is sort of where, for me, my life as an organizer, my life as a musician, where they intersect. And so I've got those. I've got one called Precious Memories. You don't know the um, Real World, originally the Real World String Band out of Kentucky.
Mhm.
So Sue Masick, their banjo player,
Right.
stars in my show, Precious Memories, which is about Sarah Ogun Gunning, somebody very few people have heard of, unless they hang out at the Library of Congress. But but Sarah was, a self-described miner's wife in Bell County, Kentucky, right next to Harley County, who through the most amazing series of, you name it, fate, coincidence, ended up, going from this desperate life where, two of her brothers had been killed in the mines, but had been disabled in the mines. Her half sister and Molly Jackson, Molly's two children, starved to death during a strike, which nothing but tragedy. And then she ended up on the Lower East Side of New York, hanging out with Woody Guthrie, with a 15-year-old Pete Seeger, with the actor Will Geer, who played Grandpa in the Waltons years later, with Leadbelly and Martha. And she's performing on stage and recording with Leadbelly. It's just, it was this,
Huh.
and then World War II comes and the scene dissipates. I love the story. I think it's a story of, rise and fall, redemption. It's just a beautiful story. And Sue was magnificent in it. She was just magnificent in it. So, and then I've got another one that I'm reworking now called Some Sweet Day. There's a history of the Southern Tenants Farmers Union and their strike in Arkansas in 1937. I mean, I love doing this, Steve, because so much of my work is about making history accessible and telling it in a way that's enjoyable. So these days, so I turned 75 last year, and I'm not going to give out my date because then people will inundate me on Facebook, and
Right.
I really don't have the time to do that. So in the run up to my 75th birthday, which these anniversaries have some significance, I came up with a new financial plan. And my family lives into its hundreds, so I'm expect and Elizabeth and I, well, both of our families live into their late 90s and hundreds, and they all grew up in unbelievable poverty, and hardship, and um, so we expect to be here another 25 years. We take very good care of ourselves to the extent that is possible. So my new financial plan: stay home with Elizabeth, watch the money roll in. It's a good plan, right? You're dazed. You're stunned.
Got dazed, exactly.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I think it was Kathy Mattea who said, "How's that working for you?"
Right.
And then there's a couple here that Tim and Sarah Williams, wonderful songwriters, and Sarah said, "Well, it's a wonderful plan with that intonation, right?" But basically, what I'm doing now is taking what credibility I have, and in the folk and bluegrass worlds, and trying to put it behind young musicians
Mhm.
who are wonderful artists, but who have a humane commitment, who care about the fate of people and the fate of the world. And um, yeah, I do make them record my own songs, because I've got, I'm not totally altruistic. I mean, I'll help anybody, but to do a major effort. So, there are now, I think, 5 of those albums. The first was by the great Irish American artist Joe Jenks, who did an album called The Forgotten, and I think I can never remember the subtitle, something like Recovered Treasures from the Pen of Saigon. I'm like, Joe, I haven't used a pen to write songs in 30 years, and neither of you. He said, yeah, but if it's like Recovered Treasures from Saigon's laptop, it's weird. It's just weird. People think you had a computer crash. But and it's basically, he chose, I gave him 70 songs to choose from, all unrecorded. And they're mostly songs about working people, working communities, unions, struggles, along those lines. And, and when we were working out the deal, and I said, you have absolute creative control. He said, what does that mean? I said, it means that if you so choose, when it's done, you send me the album. He said, you can't be serious. I said, no, I'm very serious. I've learned managing nonprofit organizations, the way you get great work out of people is, first, you choose people who have the capacity to do great work. You give them very clear instructions. You agree on what has to be done. You leave them alone, but you give them full support if they ask for it. So I said, yeah. I said, you're not going to hear from me. He says, well, you care about the title, which songs I choose, the producer? I'm like, your business, buddy. And he chose Ken Whiteley, who's just an extraordinary. I got to tell you a story about Ken. So, and we're all union brothers in Local 1000, the American Federation of Musicians. So, and I'm always kind of like, I want to know who people are. I said, so, where were you born? And he said, he said, I was born in your hometown, State College, Pennsylvania. I'm like, how old are you? He told me. I said, you were not born in State College. He said, what do you mean I wasn't born in State College? I said, in that year, State College didn't have a hospital. You were born in Bellefonte, the county seat, which had the only hospital. He said, oh my God, how did you know? I said, well, he said, I don't tell people Bellefonte because nobody's ever heard of it. But yeah, you're right. And I mean, Ken is immense. He's just a wonderful guy, and is skillful musician as you can find. So they recorded in his home studio using all Canadian musicians. It's brilliant. It's just brilliant. And Joe, when we were negotiating the deal, Joe said, part of the deal is you do 20 concerts and festivals with me. And I'm like, hey, I'm sorry, I'm retired. I'm not doing the road anymore. He said, well, I guess you don't want me to do this album. Dang, right? So we ended up doing it. And I learned so much. I mean, I don't read or write music. I wish I did. I don't. I write a song, I record it. Somebody else figures it out. Joe is musically trained at a very, very high level. And I just learned so much about how to perform and practical stuff. Like, we had done our sound check and I'm picking up my guitar. I'm going to the green room. He said, no, leave it on stage. I'm like, well, why would I leave it on stage? He said, because there's going to be a temperature differential between the green room. The green room is where musicians sit before the show. Usually it's like in Rochester, it's the men's bathroom. So, it's not exactly high end. he said, so it'll get colder in the green room, and then when you come back on stage, it'll go out of tune slightly.
Right.
So you have to spend your first couple of songs tuning. He says, just leave it here. I mean, and I really, really learned to sing harmony with them in a way. It was great working out how to perform together. So and then this year, as you know, the 100th anniversary of women in the United States finally getting the right to vote, not a gift, after fighting for years and literally being tortured in jail and, force fed and beaten and, and hung from the ceiling. So two these wonderful young artists. Well, I mean, Joe's 30 years younger than me, but Sarah Lynch Thomason is in her early 30s. Sam Gleaves is 27. They've been friends since they were teenagers, and so I asked them to do an album called I Have Known Women, and in celebration of the 100th anniversary of women getting the vote. Again, these were all unrecorded. They chose, I think, 9 unrecorded songs. They wanted to do 3 songs of mine that had been done in a long time. One called Truck Driving Woman. And then the 3 of us together wrote a song called 1920 about the 100th anniversary. They brought in Hazy Chacho, who was in Laurie Lewis's band, The Right Hands, and Liam Purcell, who's from Deep Gap, North Carolina, Doc Watson's hometown. Liam is so good that he got one of the rare presidential scholarships to attend the Berklee School of Music, which is like a completely free ride. He's a musical genius. And, and he and I are writing songs together, starting, I think, when he was 16. So, and then I talked about, the Far Side, Matt Watroba, Vivian and John, who are not younger by much, did a cast album for Mother Jones in Heaven. My friend and neighbor, Katie Oates, who's a native white Southerner, is about to come out with a beautiful album called We Go On, about the joys and sorrows, the trials and tribulations of being a native white Southerner. And I've got, another 8 or 10 song cycles. I'm talking to a bluegrass band about doing my song cycle. You know the song In the Still of the Night?
Mm-hmm.
So this is called In the Night of the Still.
Ah.
And it's 21 songs that about moonshining. There's all these jokes. So there's the Beverly Hillbillies and hee-haw. Moonshining was the way in which people in Appalachia survived since they got to this country. And the first military action that George Washington undertook after he became president, he sent 2,000 militia to Western Pennsylvania to suppress a rebellion by small farmers and small distillers in what was called the Whiskey Rebellion. It was in 1794. And he had tried to tax their whiskey, and they had said, nope. And they took up arms and started marching, So I'm interested in this history, and it's got, it's serious, because this is how people lived. That's how they survived in a primarily in a barter economy. And then I like the idea that, that I think people today don't know that there simply were no roads in the mountains. No roads, right? You traveled on the creeks, and if you had things to haul, you built a wooden sled and you got a steer or an ox to drag it down the creek beds. And by and large, it was a frontier survival economy, and you made virtually everything that you needed, but you couldn't make an axe head, and you couldn't make needles. So once a year you went to town, and your only real cash crop was corn. But imagine putting enough corn on a sled to buy even a needle, right? It's so what these ancient Appalachians did, they literally created what today we call liquid acids, right? They reduced all this bulky corn down to one jug of moonshine. So there's songs about there's some songs that are so outrageous that you think I made them up,
Hmm.
like about a friend of mine who actually shot down a revenuer's plane. I mean, it's a song called "He Shot Down the Plane." It's just he had spent the whole. And this is a guy I knew. I'm not going to tell you his name. He's a one-armed sawmiller, and that I knew back when I lived in the North Georgia mountains. And we were sitting there, and he says, "Sorry, buddy, did I ever tell you about that time I shot down that revenuer's plane?" I'm like, "You did what?" He said, "I guess I didn't tell you the story." He says, "Well," he said, "I always wanted to know what the perfect still would look like. He said, and so, one winter, was we're not making shine in the winter because there's no leaves on the trees. We can't hide. He says, so yeah, I got the best copper I could find and the best rivets. And, I made the worm and he says, it was size. It was beautiful. It was just beautiful. I took like 3 or 4 months. And then when I got it done, I got my mule and put it on a sled, dragged it up to the spring head where I, always did my stuff and then put it back together. He said, and then he said, I couldn't stand it. He said, I had to know how it was going to work. And the leaves weren't out yet. But I figured, oh, well, the revenues won't be out either. So I, put the bash in, put the bash in there and lit the fire and smoke started rising. And I heard that whirring sound. And I looked up and there was that revenue and that single engine says, he said, I know I shouldn't have done it, but I just lost my temper. I knew, I know he'd seen it. I know. So I picked up my 22 and I shot him through the wing. I'm like, you did what? He says, yeah, I know. I shouldn't have done it. I really shouldn't have done it. I said, well, what happened? He said, well, he landed safely. He was pretty bad. I'm like, well, I guess so. He said, he wasn't hurt. I'm just glad he wasn't hurt. I said, well, what happened to you? He said, oh, well, I did 3 years. I'm like, well, he said, and the chorus is that single engine Cessna. I heard it loud and clear. Knew the pilot saw the still I'd worked to build all year. I just I picked up my 22. I took careful aim, slowly squeezed the trigger, and I shot down that plane. And the chorus goes, "You shot down that plane?" Says, I shot down that plane, And at the end it says, now you've heard my story. The moral is really clear. You may spend some time in prison, but you'll tell the tale for years. It's a true story. So I'm pitching it to a bluegrass band. I'm not going to name names. We'll see if they do it. But that is, I wrote to him and said, honestly, you guys are so scruffy. They are. They're really scruffy. They look like a picture of the James Gang.
Right.
I said, I know that Anani's going to say, I bet them old boys run some shine themselves. And later today, okay, so you know who Junior Johnson is?
Uh-huh.
Does your audience know who Junior Johnson is?
That's a good question.
Okay, so Junior Johnson, Wilkes County, North Carolina. That's where Elizabeth and I have our cabin that we do our writing. And we just got back from there yesterday. So Wilkes County was the leading moonshine county in North Carolina until moonshine became legal if you paid your taxes. Now it's the number 1 marijuana county in North Carolina, just showing the flexibility and adaptability of good working people, right? So there's so many movies about moonshining, and there's one that I think is pretty good called the Franklin County War, and where you see the collusion between law enforcement and the moonshiners, and everybody's kin to everybody. So and it is not considered disrespectable to make moonshine. In fact, a lot of the people are the local heroes. But the market for moonshine is the urban areas. So Wilkes County sells to Charlotte, North Georgia sells to Atlanta, and the revenuers, it's called revenuers because the whole issue is around the payment of taxes. Right. That's the issue. That was the issue in the Whiskey Rebellion. That's the issue today. So they are agents of the Internal Revenue Service, and they're called revenuers. I mean, probably it should be revenuers, but we call them revenuers. So you needed fast drivers who could outrun the revenuers, who are always laying traps for them. And in Wilkes County was famous for the speed shops that built the specially equipped cars, because you put 100 gallons of moonshine in the back of your car or your truck, you're going to be dragging,
Yeah.
a lot of weight. So you have to, especially you have to put in extra heavy springs and shocks, but then you have to compensate so that it still sways naturally, and you have to put in big 365 cubic inch Hemi engines that are specially modified so that you can go to 120 miles an hour. So Junior, when he was like 13 years old, Junior Johnson, his family owned a speed shop and ran moonshine, and he was the best driver the world has ever known. He's just he created the special turn where you can actually slam on the brakes, spin your car 180 degrees, and go off the other direction.
Right.
I have not tried that. I'm not going to try that. So eventually, and so then the different drivers started racing against each other on Sundays on dirt tracks, and eventually that became NASCAR, the official racing industry in the United States. And Junior, started racing legal. He won 50 races. That is still the all-time record for NASCAR. And then he retired. He just died last year.
Yeah.
So his family went legal. So it became possible to actually license some of these stills. So he started making Midnight Moon, which you can buy in the legal ABC stores here in North Carolina. All sales are by the state, and the money goes to education and law enforcement. It's a good deal.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to see if I can't get Midnight Moon, Junior's Distillery, to sponsor this band. Give a sponsorship deal, maybe help pay for it. And I think it'll be just great. But I want to tell the true history. I don't want to do the any of the hillbilly shows things. I want to do something that's dignified and that tells the true story of how people survived.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're getting toward the end of our time, so I did want to ask you one last question. So that's sort of some of your current projects that you just talked about, but you've also pitched to me a couple of times an idea that you have for a research project that you think someone should do involved.
Yes. Here's the deal.
Mill. So Arrogant Mill was a song that was on that first album that you made.
Yep,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah. So explain the idea behind this project.
And it's a good thing we're coming to the end because I've got 4% of my battery left. That's the only one to talk about. So my song Aragon Mill has passed into tradition. So there are places where, in Ireland they say Ireland is sung as Belfast Bill, and say I'd like to sing an old song from the north. It's totally divorced from my authorship. But over the years, okay, so there are all these arguments about the oral tradition. You guys at the Library of Congress and the Archive of Folk Music, it's got a different name now, right? What do you guys call it?
Well, it's alternately called the Archive of Folk Culture.
Okay.
American Folklife Center Archive.
All right. Well, just patch in wherever I said it wrong. Just patch it in. All right. So there's this whole argument about oral transmission of folk culture, which has to say with like how do songs change over all these centuries? How do they become other songs? Somebody told me that Alan Lomax, the great collector, believed that songs improve over time. This is arguable. I'm not sure that I Will Twine with My Mingles and Raven Black Hair isn't improved, but it is kind of cool. It's cool, but that's not Linda, the wonderful Linda Williams of Robin and Linda tracked it down to a parlor song of the late 19th century. And that's not what that line is. I don't know what it is. So I'll hang with the Mingles, So there are now 7 structurally different versions of Aragon Mill. If I could do really quickly, my original was actually 6 verses ballad style. When we did the first recording, I counted wrong and I had 7 verses. So I had to repeat one of the verses to make it come out. And then the Red Clay Ramblers did it, and they did 2 verses chorus, 2 verses chorus verse chorus. Then the Furies, the um, the brothers band in Ireland did it, but they thought it was uneven to have, so they did it two verses chorus, and then they wrote an extra verse so it could be two verses chorus.
All right.
Hazel Dickens did it. She left the verse, but I can't say on the air what she told me about why she did it, because it involves one of the seven deadlies. But yeah, it's a great story. Seamus Kennedy added 10 verses. Because his kinfolk worked in the mills in Belfast, so he describes the mills and the names of the mills, and he kind of makes it more Irish. So where I wrote, "There's no children at all in the narrow, empty streets," Seamus wrote, "There's no children at all in the wee, dark, narrow streets." And he was interviewed by Pete Peterson for an article about Aragon Mill in the Old Time Herald magazine, started by the great Alice Gerard of Hazel and Harris, but Hazel and Alice, but in her own right, just a magnificent artist and historian. And Seamus told Pete, he said, I can't walk into an Irish pub and sing a song that's only 6 verses long. I'd be run out of there. I had to make it 16 verses, right? So a doctoral student could do a thesis on this. They could advance an idea about how world tradition changed, and then they could interview 40 or 50 people. There's at least 100 recordings of the song in many languages, and say things like, how did you learn it? Where did you learn it? Did you learn it from a book, from an album? Did you hear it at a festival? One band out in Iowa heard it at a festival in Ireland, and they recorded it as Oregon Mill.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they heard, right?
Makes sense.
And you can say, were you aware of multiple versions? Did you make changes yourself? And I think out of that, you could document what has happened in 45 years. You could get a theory about what's happened in 450. So yeah, I would love to have somebody do that. And I'll work with them and help them.
All right. Well, hopefully someone will see this video and take you up on that, because that would be a lot of fun, I think.
That'd be great. Thank you. This was great.
Cy, thank you so much for this interview, and thank you for the concert as well. Thank you for participating in the Archive Challenge several times over the years, and we hope that you'll join us again.
Well, all you need to do is ask.
All right. Thanks so much.